What if everything you were taught about the American Civil War was only half the story? Most people grow up hearing one clean sentence: the North fought the South because of slavery, full stop, end of story. It sounds simple, tidy, and morally satisfying, but if that single sentence were the whole truth, why did it take more than 80 years of political fighting, 4 failed compromises, and a slowly collapsing financial system before a single shot was ever fired at Fort Sumter? Why did Northern banks quietly finance Southern plantations for decades? Why did British textile mills desperately care about a war fought on the other side of the ocean? And why did some of the loudest defenders of states' rights only ever seem to invoke that right when it came to one specific issue and stay strangely silent about it everywhere else? Why does a war that supposedly had one clear cause require an entire library of competing books, each claiming to have finally found the real answer? The real story of the Civil War is not a simple morality tale with clear heroes and villains lined up on either side of a battlefield. It is a tangled, decades-long web of money, law, politics, and human suffering, all wound tightly around one another. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many textbooks flatten one of the most complex conflicts in American history into a single sentence, and why that flattening, however well-intentioned, quietly distorts the truth. Before we go any further, let's be completely, unmistakably clear about one thing. Slavery was the central moral catastrophe of the Civil War era, and there is no honest version of this story in which slavery is not the primary evil driving the conflict forward. Any narrative that tries to erase, minimize, or dance around that fact is not history, it is propaganda, and we are not going to entertain it here. This video is not an attempt to soften slavery's role or to offer some kind of both sides excuse for the Confederacy. What this video is about is something historians often skip over in a rushed classroom lecture. Slavery did not exist in a moral vacuum, floating separately from everything else happening in 19th century America. It was woven directly into banking systems, international trade networks, congressional representation, and the entire question of westward expansion. Our thesis for this video is straightforward. The Civil War happened because slavery, economics, politics, finance, and territorial power were all fused together into a single explosive system, and pulling on any one thread threatened to unravel the entire structure. Understanding that web, thread by thread, is the only way to truly understand why compromise after compromise ultimately failed, and why war eventually became unavoidable rather than merely likely. To understand how the nation reached that breaking point, we have to rewind decades before Fort Sumter, long before most textbook chapters on the Civil War even begin. In 1828, Congress passed a sweeping tariff so unpopular across the South that critics quickly nicknamed it the Tariff of Abominations. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods in order to protect growing northern factories from cheaper foreign competition. But Southern planters, who exported raw cotton and imported nearly everything else, felt they were being forced to subsidize northern industrial growth out of their own pockets. South Carolina was furious, and its political leadership, including the powerful Vice President John C. Calhoun, argued that individual states possessed the constitutional right to nullify federal laws they considered unjust or unconstitutional. This argument triggered the nullification crisis of 1832, when South Carolina formally declared the tariff void within its own borders and threatened armed resistance if the federal government tried to enforce it. President Andrew Jackson responded forcefully, threatening military action and pushing Congress to authorize force if necessary. And the crisis was only diffused at the last moment through a face-saving compromise tariff. But something had shifted permanently in the nation's political psychology. The idea of states' rights, the belief that individual states could resist, override, or ultimately leave the federal union entirely, had taken firm root in Southern political thought. Crucially, this was not originally an argument about slavery at all. It was fundamentally about economic policy, tariffs, and regional identity. And yet, the very same legal reasoning and philosophical arguments developed during the nullification crisis would resurface again and again over the following decades, eventually becoming the intellectual backbone of the secessionist argument 3 decades later. The seeds of disunion, in other words, were planted long before slavery became the headline issue that most people associate with the war today. It's worth pausing here to notice something important. The very first serious threat of secession in American history had nothing to do with slavery at all. It was about tariffs, trade, and regional economic power. This matters because it shows that the mechanism of secession, the legal and philosophical toolkit for a state to defy or leave the Union, was invented and tested years before slavery became the primary reason to use it. By the time slavery did become the dominant political issue of the 1850s, Southern leaders already had a fully developed constitutional argument sitting ready and waiting. They simply had to apply an existing tool to a new and far more explosive purpose. This is exactly why historians describe the road to war as gradual rather than sudden. Every decade added another layer of grievance, another precedent, another piece of political machinery that would later be repurposed. Understanding the tariff of abominations and the nullification crisis is not a distraction from the slavery story. It is the foundation the slavery story was eventually built on top of. Now, let's talk about money, because this is the part most textbooks rush straight past. Slavery was not only a moral horror, it was also, quite literally, the single largest financial asset class in the entire United States. By 1860, the market value of enslaved human beings in the South exceeded the combined value of every American railroad, every factory, and every bank put together. Enslaved people were used as collateral for mortgages and business loans. They were bought and sold on organized commercial exchanges, and they were insured against death or escape like any other valuable property. Cotton, the product of that forced and brutal labor, accounted for more than half of all American export revenue by the eve of the war. This single crop powered an enormous share of the entire Atlantic economy. Southern cotton fed textile mills in Massachusetts just as reliably as it fed mills in Manchester, England. Northern banks headquartered in New York and Boston financed southern plantations, insurance policies on slave ships and human cargo, and profited enormously from cotton shipping, trade credit, and commodity speculation. Wall Street itself, in its earliest and most formative decades, grew wealthy processing the financial machinery of Southern slavery. British financial firms extended enormous lines of credit to Southern planters and depended on a steady, uninterrupted cotton supply to keep their own textile industries running profitably. This created an uncomfortable and often ignored truth. The North was never simply a righteous abolitionist bloc standing in clean moral opposition to a wicked South. Northern industry, shipping, and finance were deeply and profitably entangled with the very institution that many Northerners publicly claimed to oppose. Slavery, in this sense, was not merely a Southern institution, it was a national and even international economic engine, and that is precisely why untangling it proved so agonizingly, violently difficult. Consider the numbers for a moment. Historians estimate that by 1860, the combined market value of enslaved people in the United States was somewhere in the range of $3 billion in the currency of the time, a staggering figure that dwarfed the era's entire manufacturing sector. That wealth was not abstract. It sat on ledgers in New Orleans, Charleston, and New York. It backed mortgages, it insured shipping voyages, and it determined who could borrow money and on what terms. Entire law firms specialized in slave sales and inheritance disputes. Insurance companies wrote specific policies covering the loss of enslaved individuals during transport. This was not a fringe activity confined to a few plantations. It was mainstream American finance, deeply respectable and deeply profitable, which is exactly why so many people at every level of society, North and South, had a financial incentive to look away from its brutality. With that economic backdrop firmly in place, the political fault lines only grew wider and more dangerous with each passing decade. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise attempted to carefully balance the number of free and slave states by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state simultaneously, while drawing an imaginary line across the vast Louisiana territory to determine where slavery could and could not expand in the future. This compromise held for roughly 30 years, but only just barely, and only because both sides quietly agreed not to test its limits. Then, as the nation expanded dramatically westward following the Mexican-American War, the entire question exploded back into national politics. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to patch things together once again, admitting California as a free state while simultaneously imposing a far stricter Fugitive Slave Act that legally forced ordinary Northern citizens to actively participate in capturing and returning escaped enslaved people to bondage. This single law radicalized enormous numbers of previously neutral Northerners almost overnight. Then, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the old compromises entirely by allowing settlers in newly organized territories to vote directly on whether slavery would be legal there, a concept known as popular sovereignty. The result was immediate chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the Kansas territory from both directions. The region quickly descended into brutal, armed sectarian conflict that became infamously known as Bleeding Kansas, a grim preview of the much larger war still to come. In 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision ruled that enslaved people, and even free black Americans, were not legally citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court, and further declared that Congress had no constitutional power whatsoever to ban slavery in any federal territory. This ruling outraged the North, energized the abolitionist movement, and simultaneously emboldened the South, effectively destroying any remaining hope for future legislative compromise. Then, in 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led a small but violent armed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping desperately to spark a widespread slave uprising across the South. He failed within days and was quickly captured, tried, and executed But Southern political leaders seized on the raid as living proof that the North secretly intended violent, forcible abolition, while many Northerners quietly began to view Brown as a righteous martyr for a just cause. Each of these individual events did not simply add a little more tension to an already strained Union. They compounded on top of one another, making any lasting political compromise structurally, almost mathematically impossible. Notice the pattern across these decades. Each compromise bought a little more time, but each one also raised the political price of the next compromise, because both sides increasingly felt they were losing ground. Northern public opinion hardened with every new law that seemed to force ordinary citizens into complicity with slavery, while Southern political leaders grew increasingly convinced that only rigid legal protections and outright secession could safeguard their entire way of life and their economic system. By the late 1850s, moderate voices on both sides were rapidly losing influence to more radical factions, and the political center that had absorbed every previous shock for 40 years was finally running out of room to maneuver. By 1860, the nation stood right at the very edge of the abyss. Abraham Lincoln, representing the newly formed Republican Party, won the presidency that November without receiving a single electoral vote from any Southern state whatsoever. To Southern political leaders, this single fact was undeniable proof that the North now possessed enough raw political power to control the nation's entire future without needing any Southern consent at all, ever again. Within just weeks of the election result, South Carolina became the very first state to formally secede from the Union, and it was quickly followed by 6 additional states across the Deep South. These seceding states swiftly formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their new president. What is often conveniently left out of the popular story is what these states actually said, in their own words, when they seceded. In their official declarations of secession, states like Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia explicitly and repeatedly named the preservation of slavery as their primary, central reason for leaving the Union. There was no ambiguity whatsoever in their own official documents. The economic and political grievances that had been quietly building for more than 3 decades finally converged into one singular, undeniable trigger. The Union stood firm on one side, a fragile and newly formed Confederacy stood defiantly on the other, and the terrible machinery of war was already beginning to slowly, inevitably turn. This brings us directly to the central argument of this entire video. Yes, unquestionably, the Civil War was about slavery. The secession documents prove this beyond any reasonable doubt, and any modern attempt to claim otherwise is simply historically dishonest and should be treated as such. But slavery was never an isolated cause, sitting neatly by itself, disconnected from everything else happening around it. It was the beating heart of an entire interconnected system, an economic engine worth many billions of dollars in today's money, a political structure that granted the South additional congressional representation through the notorious 3/5 clause, a source of enormous national and international banking profit, and the primary currency of every territorial expansion debate for nearly 40 consecutive years. Slavery was the undeniable moral core of the conflict. But tariffs, banking interests, states' rights philosophy, and westward expansion together formed the pressurized system that slavery ultimately detonated within. Removing slavery from this story entirely would be dishonest, but treating slavery as a completely standalone issue, disconnected from finance, law, and politics, is equally incomplete and equally misleading. The war was about slavery, and slavery in turn was about almost everything else too. The conflict was never purely a domestic American affair either. Britain and France, the 2 dominant global powers of that era, depended heavily on steady Southern cotton imports to keep their massive textile industries running, and Confederate diplomats desperately hoped this economic dependency would eventually force direct European military intervention on their behalf, a calculated strategy historians now commonly call cotton diplomacy. It ultimately failed for several reasons, partly because Britain successfully found alternative cotton sources in Egypt and India, and partly because British public opinion increasingly turned against slavery as a moral institution. Meanwhile, several border states, including Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, legally permitted slavery, yet remained firmly within the Union, forcing President Lincoln to walk an extraordinarily careful political tightrope throughout the entire war. This is precisely why the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 applied only to Confederate-controlled territory and deliberately not to loyal slaveholding border states, a decision that remains widely misunderstood today. It functioned as a calculated wartime and diplomatic tool just as much as it functioned as a genuine moral declaration, carefully designed to prevent border states from seceding while simultaneously reframing the war internationally as a moral fight against slavery, which in turn discouraged British intervention on the Confederate side. It is easy to forget just how global this supposedly domestic war truly was. Confederate agents traveled to London and Paris, seeking loans, weapons, and formal diplomatic recognition, arguing that European economies simply could not survive without Southern cotton. For a brief period, this argument seemed to work, and both Britain and France flirted seriously with recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate independent nation. Had that recognition happened, the entire trajectory of the war, and quite possibly its outcome, could have looked completely different. The fact that it never materialized was not an accident. It was the result of careful Union diplomacy, shifting cotton supply chains, and a growing moral discomfort among ordinary British citizens, who increasingly saw the war as a fight against slavery rather than a simple trade dispute between distant states. So why did this war ultimately become inevitable rather than merely avoidable? Because the United States had gradually built two fundamentally incompatible economic systems within a single political union, an increasingly industrialized free labor North and a deeply agrarian slave labor South, both simultaneously expanding westward and both requiring absolute political dominance in order to protect their own competing systems. Every single compromise passed from 1820 onward was, in reality, only a temporary patch applied over a much deeper structural contradiction that simply could not hold forever. Slavery guaranteed enormous Southern wealth and outsized political power through congressional representation, while simultaneously making true long-term national economic integration essentially impossible to achieve. Historians who argue the war was only about states' rights conveniently ignore that the primary right actually being defended was always specifically the right to enslave other human beings. Historians who argue the war was only about slavery in some kind of isolated vacuum ignore an entire century of financial and political architecture that made that institution so deeply entrenched and so violently, desperately defended. Both extreme positions miss the fuller truth. This was a genuine systemic collapse, not merely a single-issue political dispute that could have been resolved with one more compromise. Think of it less like a single argument that got out of hand, and more like two entire economic civilizations sharing one flag, one Congress, and one currency, while pulling in opposite directions on almost every major question of the era. A tax dispute in one decade, a court ruling in another, a failed raid in a third, none of these alone would have caused a war. But layered together, decade after decade, they formed a structure that had no stable equilibrium left to settle into. The consequences of the Civil War still visibly shape America today, more than a century and a half later. The Union's eventual victory ended legal slavery and preserved the nation as a single political entity. But it also triggered rapid northern industrialization, a dramatic and permanent expansion of federal power over individual states, and generations of unresolved racial and economic inequality that persisted long after Reconstruction ultimately collapsed. The economic patterns established well before the war, wealth built directly on exploited human labor, deep regional inequality, and constantly contested federal authority, continue to echo through American political and economic life well beyond 1865. The war also permanently changed how Americans understood the relationship between the federal government and the individual states, shifting real power toward Washington in ways that would have seemed unthinkable to the generation of Jackson and Calhoun. Even today, arguments over federal versus state authority, over economic inequality between regions, and over the long shadow of slavery's legacy on race relations in America can all trace at least part of their roots directly back to this exact unresolved tension. So here's the big lesson to take away from all of this. Historians rarely get their basic facts wrong. What they far more often get wrong is the frame they choose to place around those facts. Reducing the entire Civil War down to a single tidy cause makes for a cleaner, more shareable story, but real history is almost never clean and rarely fits neatly into one sentence. The genuine skill in understanding the past is not simply memorizing dates and battle names. It is learning to see the deeply interconnected systems, economic, political, legal, and moral, that make historical events feel inevitable in hindsight rather than purely accidental. The Civil War was absolutely about slavery. It was also at the very same time about money, banking, law, power, and control. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and refusing to hold both truths at once, insisting on one clean cause instead of a tangled web of causes, is exactly how well-meaning historians and textbook writers end up quietly getting the story wrong, even when every individual fact they present is technically accurate. If this deeper, more complete look at history changed the way you personally see the Civil War, take a second to hit, like on this video right now, and subscribe for more deep dives that challenge the overly simple version of history most of us were taught back in school. And if you want to see how this exact same interconnected web of money, banking, and political power went on to shape the world after the war ended, stay tuned, because that next story is coming very soon, and it might change how you see modern America just as much as this one changed how you truly see its past.